As we all think about staying healthy as we get older, a big piece of that puzzle is keeping our minds sharp.
Absolutely. It's something on a lot of people's minds.
And with things like Alzheimer's becoming, well, more prevalent, researchers are really looking at all sorts of factors, things that might influence our cognitive abilities throughout life.
Right, trying to understand all the different angles.
So today, we're diving into a really fascinating area, the potential connection between our religious and spiritual involvement, let's call it RSI, and how well our brains function.
It's an intriguing link, definitely.
We've got some compelling research here that explores this. And our mission today really is to understand the evidence. What does it say about this connection?
And maybe explore the role social engagement plays in it all.
Exactly. And also, think about whether the way we measure these things, RSI or cognitive function, actually affects what we find.
Yeah, the methodology matters.
And the core of our discussion is this systematic review by Hosseini, Choreja, and Oremus. Gives us a great overview.
Exactly. This review, it's like taking a big step back to look at a whole body of research, not just one study.
A meta-analysis, basically.
Sort of, yeah. They systematically searched major databases, Ovid Medline, Psychinfo, Embase,
The big ones?
the really big ones, yeah, and even Google Advanced Search. They looked for studies published between 1990 and September 2016.
Right.
And these databases, they were really the foundation for medical and psychological research, just tons of peer-reviewed work.
Right.
And they were specifically looking for studies that compared groups of adults and examined, well, whether there was a link between their RSI levels and their cognitive abilities.
Okay, so they weren't just looking at, say, one specific type of study. What kind of criteria did they actually use to pick the studies for the review?
Well, they had a few key things. First, the studies had to include adults 18 and over,
Right.
and from all sorts of settings living in the community, long-term care, hospitals.
No.
It didn't matter where.
Okay, broad scope there.
Yeah. And second, they were really broad in how they defined RSI. It could be anything from, like, how often someone went to services.
Church attendance, that kind of
Yeah, or how often they prayed, their attitudes towards religion, spirituality, or even just how important faith was to them personally.
multifaceted.
Very. And finally, the studies had to use some kind of validated measure for cognitive function.
So proper tests.
Proper tests, exactly. Things like the mini mental state examination, the MMSE, which gives a general snapshot.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it's common. Or maybe more specific tests looking at, say, memory recall or problem-solving skills.
That sounds like a pretty thorough approach.
Okay.
So how many studies actually made the cut out of everything they looked at?
Well, they started with a huge number, over 8,000 potential citations initially.
Wow.
Yeah, but after a really careful screening process, applying all those criteria we just talked about, they narrowed it down to 17 studies that met their standards.
17. Okay, and what types were they most?
Mostly cohort studies, those follow people over time, and cross-sectional studies, which are like a snapshot at one point in time.
Got it.
And these 17 studies, together, involved a really large group of people, over 35,000 participants in total.
That's significant.
It is, and the age range was pretty wide, too, from people in their mid-40s up to their early 90s.
All right, so after sifting through all that data from those 17 studies, what was the main finding? What did this review actually tell us about the relationship between RSI and, well, our brains?
Yeah, the bottom line, the most striking finding was that the vast majority, around 82% of these studies, found a positive association.
Positive, meaning RSI was linked to better cognitive function.
Exactly. It suggests that for many people, engaging with their faith or spirituality might actually have a protective effect on their cognitive abilities, particularly as they get older.
Interesting.
It is, though it's worth noting the review didn't dig super deep into the strength of that link, like how much protection it offers. This was more about whether the link exists.
Okay, but still, 82% finding a positive connection. That's fascinating. So for someone who is actively religious or spiritual, this isn't just about, faith providing comfort.
Right.
It might actually be contributing to their brain health.
Uh-huh.
That feels like it has some pretty big implications.
It really does. The researchers themselves point this out. If this connection holds up in more research, it could be important for public health.
How so?
Well, supporting religious and spiritual practices for those who already identify with them might be one way to help promote cognitive well-being, especially in older adults.
Like actively supporting it.
Yeah. They even gave a practical example, like setting up transportation programs to help isolated older adults get to religious services.
Ah, addressing a barrier to participation.
Exactly. A very tangible
That
thing.
makes sense. Okay, now let's dig a bit deeper into how this connection might actually work. In the brain, I mean. What are the theories about why RSI could be linked to better cognitive function?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? How does it work? Well, one prominent idea, drawing on work by people like Koenig and others,
Yeah.
is that RSI can act as a significant buffer against stress.
Ah, stress relief.
Yes. We know that chronic stress, anxiety, depression, they can be really bad for memory and other cognitive functions, partly because they elevate cortisol levels.
Right, the stress hormone.
Exactly. And religious or spiritual practices often provide coping mechanisms, a strong sense of social support, a framework for meaning, all things that can help reduce those psychological stressors.
That makes a lot of sense. A strong faith can definitely be a source of resilience when things get tough. What's another potential pathway? Is it just stress?
No, not just stress. Another interesting possibility is that the very act of engaging in religious practices can stimulate higher level cognitive functions.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. Many faiths involve interpreting texts, right? Engaging in theological discussions, grappling with ethical questions, contemplating abstract concepts like morality, the meaning of existence. These kinds of activities, they require abstract reasoning, sustained mental engagement.
Hmm, like a workout for the brain.
It could be, yeah. Almost like a form of mental exercise built into the practice itself.
So it's not just about feeling better emotionally, it's also about actively using your brain in these specific ways.
Precisely. And then there's a third key element, which researchers like Hill have highlighted, the social aspect.
Ah, community.
Exactly. Religious attendance, participating in spiritual communities, it often involves regular social interaction. Singing, praying together, services, community events.
Yeah, lots of interaction.
And that social engagement helps combat loneliness and isolation, which we increasingly recognize as risk factors for cognitive decline. Keeping those social connections helps keep neural pathways active.
Okay, so it sounds like potentially a powerful combination then. Reducing stress, providing mental stimulation, and fostering social connections.
Yeah, it looks like those three might work together.
Now, the review also mentions something about a life course perspective, right? Did they look at whether, like, being involved consistently throughout life matters more than maybe starting later?
That's a really important question. The life course perspective basically suggests that, things that happen to us throughout our lives can shape our health way down the line.
Makes sense.
And while this review found that general positive association, the studies they looked at didn't always have super long follow-up periods.
Ah, okay.
So it's hard to say definitively if consistent lifelong RSI engagement leads to significantly better cognitive outcomes compared to people whose involvement fluctuates or maybe who start later in life.
So the jury's still out on that specific point.
It's a little bit, yeah. But the overall trend in the findings does suggest that sustained engagement could be particularly beneficial. It points in that direction.
Okay. And like with any research, there are always limitations, right?
Mhm.
What were some of the main limitations the researchers pointed out about the studies they included in this review?
Yeah, absolutely. There were a few important caveats. One of the big challenges was just the sheer variety in how both RSI and cognitive function were measured across all those different studies.
Oh, apples and oranges kind of thing.
A bit, yeah. Some studies might focus heavily on formal church attendance, others more on personal beliefs or private prayer.
Right?
And similarly, cognitive function was assessed using a whole range of different tests, each looking at slightly different things.
So it makes it hard to compare directly.
Exactly. That lack of uniformity makes it a bit harder to draw really firm, overarching conclusions.
What else?
Another point is that most of the studies they reviewed were done in Western countries,
Okay.
and they focused mainly on Christian populations and mostly older adults.
So we don't know if it applies elsewhere.
Well, we need more research to see if these findings generalize to other religious traditions, other cultures, and different age groups, too.
Good point. Any other major limitations?
Just the one we touched on earlier. The follow-up periods in some of the cohort studies were relatively short. That makes it tough to really assess the long-term impact of RSI on cognitive decline over many, many years.
Right. Those are definitely crucial points to keep in mind when we're thinking about these findings. So, okay, let's try and bring it all together. What's the main message, the key takeaway from this deep dive into the research?
I think the central takeaway is that this systematic review gives us pretty compelling evidence suggesting a positive link. A link between actively engaging in religious and spiritual life and maintaining cognitive health as we get older.
And it's not necessarily about one specific belief system being better than another.
No, exactly. It seems to be more about the multifaceted engagement that often comes with RSI. The sense of purpose, the supportive community, the opportunities for mental activity.
All those things we discussed.
Right. That whole package appears to offer potential protective benefits for our brains.
And those benefits seem to come from how RSI can help us manage stress, keep our minds active, and stay socially connected.
Precisely. Those interconnected factors likely play a really significant role in the association that these studies observed.
So for you, our listener, as you reflect on this,
Yeah.
maybe consider the sources of meaning, connection, and mental engagement in your own life.
Yeah.
While this research looks specifically at religious and spiritual practices, what other activities provide you with similar benefits?
Yeah.
What gives you that sense of purpose, fosters those important social interactions, and keeps your mind, well, intellectually stimulated?
And this research really raises a bigger question for all of us, doesn't it? Given these potential benefits, how can we, maybe as a society, better support these kinds of enriching engagements for people who do find meaning in religion and spirituality?
That's a good point.
And maybe looking even broader, how can we apply these insights to foster cognitive well-being across all sorts of diverse populations and belief systems, exploring other ways people find meaning, connection, and mental stimulation that might offer similar protective effects?
Definitely some food for thought there as we think about how to support healthy aging for everyone.